But that's the risk you take, right? I mean, honestly, it was absurd. So we just had to roll with it in the end.
Yeah.
The 12th floor of the Redwood Development Building was nearly silent on that Friday afternoon in late June. Austin's summer heat pressed flat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the polished granite corridor into something that glittered like the surface of a lake. Security cameras hung at each corner, small, black, indifferent eyes that recorded everything and understood nothing. At 4:47 p.m., the door to Conference Room B opened. Victoria Kane stepped out first. She was 41, the kind of woman who moved through corporate spaces the way a ship's prow moves through water with the quiet confidence of something that had never been stopped. But as she stepped into the hallway, she paused. Her hand rose slowly to her hair, and she dragged her fingers through it, pulling the careful styling loose. She undid a button at her collar. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, let her shoulders cave forward slightly, and exhaled a performance of distress so controlled it looked almost real. She stood there for 11 seconds, exactly long enough. Then she walked toward the elevator, still with that hand at her mouth, her heels tapping out a rhythm on the granite, unhurried but deliberate, each step landing where she intended it. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, Daniel Brooks pushed open the same door. He was 34, lean, unremarkable in the way that genuinely competent people often are. He wore a gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he carried a wire-bound engineering notebook under his left arm, the way some men carry a phone automatically. Without thinking, as though it had become part of his body, he glanced down the corridor once, saw no one, and walked toward the stairwell. He was thinking about steel. Specifically, he was thinking about a discrepancy he had found that morning in a materials delivery manifest for the Suncrest Tower project, a 22-story mixed-use development scheduled to break ground in 45 days. The discrepancy was not large. It was, in fact, the kind of detail that most people in his position would have noted, flagged mentally, and eventually rationalized away. The numbers were close. The project was on schedule. The client was happy. Daniel had written it down instead. 48 hours later, Victoria Kane filed a formal harassment complaint with Redwood's Human Resources Department. The complaint named Daniel Brooks. No one knew yet that everything had been arranged in advance. Daniel had grown up in a house where things were fixed rather than replaced. His father, a licensed electrician named Gerald Brooks, kept a battered leather journal in the breast pocket of his work jacket, a habit he'd developed after a dispute with a homeowner who claimed Gerald had never replaced a fuse box that Gerald had, in fact, replaced and documented. The homeowner lost. But Gerald had told Daniel afterward, sitting at the kitchen table with their mugs of coffee. Asterisk. The world is full of people who will tell you that things didn't happen the way they happened. Your job is to make sure you can prove otherwise. Asterisk. Daniel had taken that literally. By the time he graduated from the University of Texas with a structural engineering degree, he had developed a documentation habit so thorough that his professors found it amusing and his fellow students found it slightly unnerving. He noted everything. Meeting dates, the precise wording of verbal agreements, the model numbers of materials referenced in specifications, the weather on the day a foundation was poured. He cross-referenced. He kept backups. His colleagues at Redwood Development called him the notebook engineer, which was meant partly as a joke and partly as a genuine description. He didn't mind. He understood that the nickname captured something accurate about him, not just the habit of recording things, but a particular relationship with truth. For Daniel, the gap between what happened and what was later claimed to have happened was not a philosophical problem. It was an engineering problem, and like any engineering problem, it had a solution: documentation. He had been with Redwood for 6 years when the Suncrest Tower project came online. He was the lead structural review engineer, responsible for overseeing materials compliance across all phases of construction. It was the kind of role that required him to be invisible when things went right and highly visible when things went wrong. Which meant, in practice, that most of the time nobody paid him much attention. His personal life was quiet in the way that happy lives often are. His wife, Emma, taught 4th grade at a public school in the Hyde Park neighborhood. Their daughter, Lily, was 6, still young enough to find her father endlessly interesting, which Daniel accepted with gratitude and no illusions about its permanence. Their house was a modest 2-bedroom on a cul-de-sac in North Loop with a live oak in the front yard that was older than the neighborhood, and a garage that Daniel had converted into a workspace where he kept a second desk, a filing cabinet, and a whiteboard. Emma teased him about the whiteboard. "You're not planning a moon landing," she told him once, standing in the garage doorway with a glass of iced tea. "You're tracking rebar shipments." "Rebar shipments matter," Daniel said. "I know they do," she smiled. "That's why I married you." He had, in the years since, tried to be the kind of husband and father who deserved that particular smile. He coached Lily's Saturday soccer team when his schedule allowed. He made breakfast on Sundays. He did not bring his work anxieties home with him, or he tried not to. He separated his professional life and his personal life the way a good engineer separates load-bearing elements from decorative ones. Cleanly, intentionally, with an understanding of which one would collapse if the other failed. He did not understand that Friday afternoon in June, as he walked down the stairwell with his notebook under his arm, that the separation was about to become impossible to maintain. There was a story Daniel had never told anyone except Emma, and even then, only once, on a night early in their relationship when they were sitting on the fire escape of her first apartment, and the city was loud beneath them, and honesty felt easier than usual. He had been 29. He had been working for a mid-sized construction firm called Hargrove & Sons, doing structural inspections on residential and light commercial projects. It was solid, unglamorous work, and he was good at it. One afternoon in early February, he was reviewing delivery records for a condominium development in Cedar Park when he noticed that the structural steel specified in the engineering plans, ASTM, a 706, a high-strength rebar formulation required for seismic resistance applications, did not match the product codes on the materials that had actually been delivered. What had been delivered was A615. Cheaper, more widely available, and not rated for the same performance requirements. The difference mattered. In certain structural configurations, under certain load conditions, it could matter enormously. He had drafted a report. He had printed it. He had held it in his hands for a long time. Emma was 4 months pregnant with Lily. They had signed the papers on their house 3 weeks earlier. The mortgage was real. The baby was real. His health insurance was through Hargrove & Sons. He put the report in the bottom drawer of his desk and said nothing. The Cedar Park condominiums were completed on schedule. They were reviewed by the city inspector. They passed. Nobody died. Nobody was hurt. The building was still standing as of the last time Daniel had checked, which was more often than he would have liked to admit. But Daniel had lived with the knowledge of what he had not done in a way that left a very specific kind of mark. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, but a permanent low-grade awareness that the world's safety depended, more than most people knew, on individuals making the correct choice at the moment when the incorrect choice was most available to them. He had failed that test once. He had understood, afterward, that he could not afford to fail it again. So he had started keeping the notebooks, not because he needed them for his own memory, his memory was excellent, but because he needed the act of writing things down to make them real enough that he could not later convince himself they had been different than they were. The notebooks were not records for other people. They were promises he made to himself. Every night, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote the day's findings in his careful, compressed handwriting. Batch numbers, delivery dates, vendor names, specification codes, the names of everyone present at every meeting, the precise wording of anything that had been said that struck him as potentially significant. Emma sometimes sat across from him and graded papers while he wrote. They didn't always talk. They didn't need to. That was the life he had built. And it was, until that June Friday, entirely sufficient. The Suncrest Tower project occupied a full city block in downtown Austin, bordered on the east by a light rail corridor and on the west by a parking structure that would be demolished once construction reached a certain phase. At 22 stories, it would be one of the taller mixed-use buildings in that part of the city, retail on the ground floor, office space on floors 2 through 8, residential units above that, rooftop amenity deck at the top. Daniel's role was to review materials compliance across all structural elements. The foundation, the core shear walls, the perimeter frame, the floor plates. It was detailed work that required physical presence at the site as well as document review in the office, and he moved between the two throughout each week. A pattern that meant he accumulated a continuous, layered picture of the project's material reality. On the morning of that Friday in June, he was at the project site reviewing intake documentation for a steel delivery that had arrived the previous afternoon. The manifest listed the batch as Batch 7C, described the material as ASTM, a 706, grade 60, high-strength deformed reinforcing bar, and noted the supplier as Consolidated Structural Supply out of San Antonio. Standard documentation. Nothing on its face unusual. But when Daniel walked the staging area and looked at the physical bars, he noted the mill marks. Mill marks on rebar are stamped directly into the steel at the point of manufacture and cannot be altered without destroying the bar. They identify the producing mill, the bar size, and the grade. A 706 bars carry a specific mark sequence that differs from a 615. The bars in Batch 7C carried A615 marks. Daniel stood in the staging area for approximately 90 seconds, not moving, the morning heat already significant, the sound of other site activity, a concrete pump running in the southeast corner, a crew doing formwork on the level above filtering in from various directions. He looked at the bars. He looked at the manifest. He looked at the bars again. Then he opened his notebook and wrote, Batch 7C delivery manifest specifies. A 706, grade 60 mill marks, confirm. A 615 discrepancy flagged, date, time. Photos attached. Asterisk. He photographed the mill marks with his phone. He photographed the manifest. He wrote the names of the 2 site workers who were present in the staging area at that moment, though neither of them had noticed what he was looking at. Then he walked back to the site office, opened his laptop, and spent 40 minutes drafting a formal materials discrepancy notification addressed to the project management team with a copy to the senior engineering director, a copy to procurement, and a copy to the company's quality assurance coordinator. The email was precise and unemotional. It described the discrepancy, attached the documentation, and requested an immediate materials audit before any additional steel from Batch 7C was incorporated into structural elements. He sent it at 1:14 p.m. Then he drove back to the main office for a 3 p.m. coordination meeting in Conference Room B. The meeting lasted 52 minutes. Victoria Kane attended the last 20 of them. She said almost nothing. She looked at Daniel once, for slightly longer than the situation required, in a way that he didn't register at the time as significant. He left the conference room at 4:49 p.m. and took the stairs. Victoria Kane had inherited neither the company nor the position, or rather, she had inherited both, but in ways she preferred not to acknowledge publicly. Her father, Raymond Kane, had founded Redwood Development in 1987 with a residential subdivision in Round Rock, and had built it, over 35 years, into a mid-sized commercial and mixed-use developer with a portfolio of projects across central Texas and the Gulf Coast. Victoria had joined the company after an MBA from Vanderbilt and a 4-year stint at a Dallas real estate investment firm, and she had worked, genuinely and with considerable skill, to establish herself as someone who had earned her senior vice presidency rather than simply received it by birth. She was, by most accounts, effective. She was demanding, precise, commercially astute, and completely transactional, in the way that certain kinds of successful people are not cruel, not personally vindictive, but fundamentally oriented toward outcomes, and willing to remove whatever stood between her and them. The Silverline Capital acquisition had been her project from the beginning. She had identified the opportunity, cultivated the relationship with the Silverline principals over 18 months of careful groundwork, and structured the terms. The deal valued Redwood Development at just over $200 million, the most significant transaction in the company's history. Its successful completion would, among other things, finally and permanently establish Victoria as the architect of Redwood's transformation from a regional developer into an institutional-grade real estate platform. It would also make her personally wealthy in a way that altered the scale of what was possible for the rest of her life. She had read Daniel's email at 2:38 p.m. on her phone, between the end of a lunch meeting and the beginning of the afternoon's coordination calls. She had read it twice. Then she had set the phone face down on her desk and sat for a moment looking at the wall. The materials discrepancy was not, in itself, a catastrophic problem. Steel substitutions happened on construction projects. They were caught, corrected, documented, and resolved. The exposure was manageable. A delay, a cost adjustment, a subcontractor dispute, reputational friction at the project level. These were inconveniences, not existential threats. What made Daniel's email dangerous was its timing and its documentation. The Silverline due diligence process was ongoing. It included a review of active project compliance records. If a materials discrepancy of this nature appeared in the compliance record in the middle of due diligence, formally flagged, officially documented, with an explicit chain of notification, it would require disclosure. It would slow the process. It would give Silverline's team reason to look more carefully at other aspects of the project portfolio, and it would raise questions about procurement practices that Victoria was not, at this particular moment, prepared to answer. That evening, she met Marcus Reed at a bar called the Driscoll Room on 6th Street. Marcus was 50, the company's COO, a pragmatist in the specific mold of men who have been solving institutional problems for long enough that they have stopped distinguishing between the ethical and the expedient. He ordered bourbon and drank it slowly and listened while Victoria explained the situation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," Victoria said, turning her glass slowly on the bar, "that Daniel Brooks is a very documented problem. His credibility is the issue. If his credibility goes, the email goes with it. People don't just lose credibility." "No," she said. "They don't. Someone has to take it from them." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was not a naive man. He understood what she was proposing in general terms, even without specifics. "You're sure there's no other way to handle the Silverline timeline?" "I'm sure," Victoria said. "We close in 11 weeks. If that compliance flag sits in the record for 11 weeks, we don't close." Marcus finished his bourbon. He set the glass down precisely. "Then handle it," he said. "But keep me out of the details." He would later spend considerable time regretting that instruction. The Human Resources complaint was filed on Monday morning at 9:15 a.m. It was 3 pages, single-spaced, formatted with the careful thoroughness of a document that had been prepared in advance rather than written in distress. It described 3 incidents. In the first, Daniel had allegedly made comments of a personal nature during a site visit in April. Remarks about Victoria's appearance that she had noted internally at the time but had not immediately reported, hoping the behavior would not recur. In the second, he had allegedly followed her to her car in the parking structure on an evening in May, approaching her from behind and placing his hand on her shoulder. In the third, the incident she characterized as the most serious, he had allegedly cornered her in Conference Room B on the previous Friday afternoon, standing too close, blocking the door, making statements she described as both threatening and sexually suggestive before she had been able to exit the room. The complaint was supported by a document described as a contemporaneous account, a dated, signed statement that Victoria claimed to have written the Friday evening after the Conference Room B incident before she had made any decision about filing formally. It was detailed, specific, and consistent with the complaint's narrative. HR opened an investigation within hours. By noon on Monday, Daniel's badge access had been suspended. By DWA, 0 pay, M, he had received a formal letter informing him that he was placed on paid administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, and was not to contact any Redwood Development personnel regarding the matter. He was instructed to return his company-issued laptop. He sat in the HR conference room, a small, windowless space with motivational posters and a bowl of individually wrapped candies on the table, and listened to the HR director read him the relevant sections of the leave notice. His hands were completely still. "Can you tell me what specifically I'm accused of?" he asked. The HR director, a woman named Christine Okafor, who had been in the role for 14 months and would later be extremely forthcoming with investigators, read him the relevant sections. Daniel listened without expression. "That's not what happened," he said. "I understand," Christine said. She sounded, to his ear, like someone who was doing a job while also being acutely aware that the job was, in some specific way, wrong. "The investigation will, the Friday incident," Daniel said. "I left the conference room 2 minutes and 40 seconds after Miss Kane did. There's camera footage. And I wasn't in the parking structure in May. I was in San Marcos that evening. Mr. Brooks, I need to ask you to let the investigation—" "I know," he said. He stood. He picked up his notebook. "I'll cooperate fully." He drove home in silence. He sat in the car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Lily noticed first that something was wrong. She was 6 and perceptive in the way that children sometimes are, not sophisticated, but finely calibrated to the emotional atmosphere of the people she loved. She sat across the dinner table from her father that Monday evening and looked at him steadily for a long time. "Ba," she said. She called him that, sometimes. A holdover from a Vietnamese family across the street whose children she played with. "Are you sad?" "No, sweetie," Daniel said. "I'm thinking." "What about?" "Work stuff." She considered this. "Is work stuff okay?" "It's going to be okay," he said. Emma, who had been watching him since he walked through the door that afternoon, caught his eye across the table. He shook his head slightly. They put Lily to bed at 8:30. At 9, Daniel sat down at the kitchen table and told Emma everything: the steel discrepancy, the email, the suspension, the complaint. He spoke in the same careful, sequential way he wrote his notes. Event, date, time, consequence. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you know who filed it?" she asked. "Victoria Kane." Emma nodded slowly. "And it's because of the email. It has to be. Then there's documentation," Emma said. "There's your email. There's the notebook. Then you fight it." He nodded. He went to the garage. Over the following 3 weeks, one section of the garage whiteboard became a timeline, not the engineering timeline he usually maintained there, but a different kind, a personal one. He mapped every event he could document. The delivery date of batch 7C, the time he photographed the mill marks, the timestamp on his email, the times of the conference room B meeting, the camera positions he had noted in the hallway, the GPS data stored on his phone that would confirm his location throughout that Friday afternoon, the receipt from a restaurant in San Marcos that placed him 40 miles from the parking structure on the evening Victoria claimed he had followed her there. He wrote across the top of the whiteboard, in block letters, "What actually happened?" Beneath it, in smaller letters, asterisk, "Prove it." Asterisk. Emma came into the garage one evening and stood there for a while, looking at the wall. "How long is this going to take?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "Daniel." She waited until he turned to look at her. "I believe you. I need you to know that I believe you." He nodded. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The subtle easing of a load that had been silently distributed across his entire posture for 3 weeks. "Thank you," he said. It came out quiet, but belief, as it turned out, was not the same as immunity. The news reached their neighborhood in the indirect way that news in small communities always does, through a mention in an industry newsletter that picked up the story from a local business blog that had obtained, through channels that were never fully clarified, a summary of the HR complaint. The story was careful in its language, noting only that a senior engineer at Redwood Development had been placed on leave pending a harassment investigation. Daniel's name was not used, but in their neighborhood, in their social circle, in the school where Lily attended first grade, the universe of people who could read between those particular lines was not small. A neighbor who had barbecued with them the previous 4th of July stopped making eye contact. Another family declined a playdate invitation for their daughter without explanation. Lily came home from school one afternoon and reported, with careful 6-year-old precision, that a boy in her class had said that her dad was in trouble. Daniel sat with her on the edge of her bed and explained that sometimes people made accusations that were not true, and that the important thing was that they trusted each other and told the truth and let the truth do its work. She looked at him very seriously. "Does the truth always win?" she asked. He thought about the Cedar Park condominiums. He thought about everything he had not said 5 years ago. "It wins more often when someone fights for it," he said. Ryan Cole was 37 and had been a journalist long enough to have developed a very specific kind of pattern recognition, a sense for the shape of things that didn't fit. He worked for the Austin Chronicle's investigative desk, which was a modest operation that did serious work. He covered construction, development, municipal contracting, the intersecting worlds where money and public safety and political pressure created the conditions for the kind of story that required 6 weeks of phone calls and 3 rounds of legal review before it could be published. He had first noticed the Redwood Development item in the business newsletter for a simple reason. The timing was unusual. An engineer files a materials compliance report on a Friday afternoon. 2 business days later, that engineer is suspended on harassment allegations. Ryan had covered enough corporate environments to know that harassment investigations, when genuine, typically moved slowly. They were not, as a general rule, initiated at institutional speed within 48 hours of a materials discrepancy filing. He started making calls. He reached Daniel through a lawyer named Patricia Stein, who had taken the case on a contingency basis after reading the same newsletter item. Patricia arranged a meeting at her office on South Congress, a second-floor space above a coffee shop with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a view of the street below. Daniel arrived with 2 notebooks. Ryan had interviewed many people in his career. He had interviewed people who were guilty and told him they were innocent. People who were innocent and couldn't convince him of it. People who were telling the truth in ways so entangled with self-interest that the truth itself became difficult to locate. He had developed, over time, a fairly reliable sense for which category he was in. Daniel Brooks, sitting across from him with 2 wire-bound notebooks open on the table and a phone showing GPS history and a folder of time-stamped photographs, struck Ryan as a man who had been documentation ready for a very long time, perhaps his entire career, and was now, for the first time, in a situation where that readiness was the only thing between him and complete destruction. "Walk me through the Friday," Ryan said. Daniel walked him through the Friday. When he finished, Ryan sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The conference room B camera," he said. "You're confident the footage is still there." "The company archives security footage for 90 days, Daniel said. "I'm inside that window. And the GPS. I was at the Suncrest Tower site from 7:12 a.m. to 1:08 p.m. I was at the office from 2:51 p.m. to 4:49 p.m. My phone never left with me to the parking structure. It was not in the parking structure in May." Ryan looked at him. "Why didn't you settle when they offered it?" "They offered me a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement and an admission of conduct inconsistent with company standards," Daniel said. "I wasn't going to sign something that said I did this, even though fighting costs more." Daniel considered the question. He looked at the whiteboard photos on his phone for a moment, the one Emma had taken of the garage wall on a night a few weeks earlier. The block letters and the timeline and the small note at the bottom. "Because I've been in a situation before where I chose the easier wrong thing," he said. "And I understood afterward what that cost. Not just to me." Ryan wrote something in his notes. Then he closed the notebook. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything about Batch 7C. Ryan spent the next 5 weeks making calls, filing public records requests, and conducting interviews that he would later describe in the acknowledgement section of the long-form piece that eventually ran as the most productive conversations I've had in this business, mostly because the people who were telling the truth had kept extraordinary records. The first significant piece of evidence was the GPS data. Daniel's phone, a company-issued device synced to a fleet management system that Redwood used for its field engineers, showed continuous location data for the past 18 months. On the evening in May, when Victoria claimed he had followed her to her car, Daniel's phone was at a restaurant called the Creekside Table in San Marcos, 41 miles south of the parking structure, from 6:15 p.m. to 8:40 p.m. The restaurant confirmed the reservation and the credit card charge. The second piece was the conference room B footage. Patricia Stein obtained it through discovery proceedings after the civil lawsuit was filed. The footage showed, at 4:47 p.m., on the Friday in question, Victoria Kane exiting conference room B. It showed her pausing in the hallway. It showed what she did with her hair and her collar. It showed her standing for 11 seconds, 11.4, to be exact, before walking toward the elevator. It showed Daniel Brooks exiting the same room 2 minutes and 38 seconds later, walking in the opposite direction without looking toward the elevator and disappearing into the stairwell. The footage was unambiguous. It did not show an interaction between them in the hallway at all. The third piece was Christine Okafor. Christine had been hired by Redwood's HR department 14 months before the complaint was filed. She was thorough, professionally conscientious, and deeply uncomfortable with what she had been asked to do. She had not been told the complaint was fabricated. She had been told only to process it with urgency, skipping the standard waiting period and preliminary review that the company's own procedures required. She had complied, and then spent the subsequent weeks in a state of increasing unease that she described when Ryan finally reached her. As knowing something was wrong and not knowing how to name it yet, she agreed to speak on background, and then, after the civil lawsuit was filed and it became clear that her own exposure was real, agreed to give a formal statement. She confirmed that the investigation timeline had been compressed at the explicit request of Marcus Reed's office, and that she had been told, not asked, told to complete the preliminary report within 72 hours. The fourth piece was an email. Ryan had suspected something like it existed. The specific sequence of events, the materials report on Friday, the complaint filed Monday morning, the speed of the suspension suggested coordination, and coordination left traces. The discovery process, which gave Patricia Stein's team access to Redwood's email server archives, produced what they were looking for: a message sent from Marcus Reed's personal email account to a second address late on the Friday evening, approximately 3 hours after Daniel's materials complaint had been logged. The email contained 8 words in the body. Asterisk. Handle Daniel before the material issue spreads. Asterisk. There was no signature. There was no response in the archive. There was only the timestamp, the sender address, and those 8 words, which managed to be simultaneously ambiguous and completely clear. Marcus Reed's attorney would later argue that the message could be interpreted as an instruction to manage a personnel situation through legitimate HR channels. The jury did not find that argument persuasive. The trial lasted 9 days. Patricia Stein had built the case over 8 months, and she presented it with the same methodical clarity that Daniel brought to his notebooks, chronologically, precisely, without theatrics. She told the jury, on the first morning, that they were going to see something unusual, a case where the defendant had done everything right, where the documentation was complete, where the evidence pointed in one direction from the beginning, and where the only question was whether the people who had tried to destroy him would be held accountable. She presented the GPS records. She played the conference room B footage, which ran silently on the courtroom screen, for just over 3 minutes while the jury watched. She put Christine Okafor on the stand and let her walk through the timeline of the HR process. Her voice steady and her demeanor consistent with someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with it. She presented the email. Victoria Kane's attorney made a competent defense. He argued that the GPS data was not conclusive, that the footage was open to interpretation, that Christine Okafor had misunderstood the instructions she'd received, that the email's meaning was ambiguous. He was methodical and professional and ultimately unsuccessful, because the evidence was not a complex mosaic that could be reassembled into a different picture. It was a sequence of documented facts that all pointed in the same direction, assembled by a man who had spent his entire career making sure that documented facts did not disappear. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. They found in Daniel's favor on all counts. The court awarded compensatory damages of $1.8 million, covering lost wages, legal fees, professional damages, and emotional distress. The jury also returned findings of fact that both Victoria Kane and Marcus Reed had engaged in deliberate fabrication of the harassment complaint for the purpose of suppressing Daniel's materials discrepancy report. The criminal referrals followed 3 weeks later. Perjury and obstruction of justice for Victoria, conspiracy and obstruction for Marcus. The DA's office accepted both. The Silverline Capital acquisition collapsed 11 days after the verdict. Silverline's principals issued a brief statement noting that they had concluded the transaction was no longer consistent with their portfolio criteria. They did not elaborate. They did not need to. The law is a mechanism for resolution. It is not, despite what people sometimes hope, a mechanism for restoration. It can determine what happened and assign consequence. It cannot undo the damage that accumulates in the interval between the wrong and the reckoning. Daniel received the settlement check on a Tuesday in April, 9 months after the materials discrepancy email, 8 months after the suspension, 6 months after the lawsuit was filed. He sat with it on the kitchen table for a while before depositing it. Emma had moved out in February. She had tried. He believed that, and would continue to believe it, because it was true. She had believed him throughout, or she had tried to believe him, which he came to understand was not exactly the same thing. The months of suspension, of social withdrawal, of Lily coming home with questions that had no good answers for a 6-year-old, of Daniel spending evenings in the garage, surrounded by documents and timelines, and evidence that was real but not yet proven. It had eroded something between them that had, as it turned out, required certain conditions to sustain itself. She was not cruel about it. She was careful and honest in the way that people who have respected each other for a long time try to be, even when they are causing each other pain. They agreed on arrangements for Lily. They did not fight about money. She told him, the last night before she moved, that she was sorry and that she believed in him and that it had simply become too much to carry. He nodded. He understood. He did not try to argue her out of it, because by then he had learned enough about certain kinds of weight to know that you cannot talk someone into continuing to carry more than they are able to carry. He kept the house. He kept the live oak in the front yard. He kept the garage and the whiteboard, though he erased the timeline eventually and returned the board to its original purpose. He had been unemployed for 4 months by the time the verdict came. The civil suit had made him, in a specific professional sense, simultaneously highly visible and extremely difficult to hire. Companies in the construction sector were not eager to bring on an engineer whose name was associated with an ongoing legal proceeding, regardless of which side of the proceeding he was on. He spent the months doing consulting work where he could find it, filing for unemployment benefits, and telling Lily, on the evenings she was with him, exactly as much as she was able to understand at any given moment. 3 weeks after the verdict, he got a call from a structural engineer named Garrett Holloway, who ran a small firm called Northbridge Engineering out of a converted warehouse space in East Austin. Northbridge was a 12-person operation that specialized in affordable housing and community infrastructure projects, the kind of work that paid modestly and mattered considerably. Garrett had read the court coverage. He had also, he told Daniel on the phone, been following the Suncrest Tower materials issue, which had by then resulted in a full structural audit and the replacement of all Batch 7C steel at substantial cost to Redwood's bonding company. "You caught something that could have hurt people," Garrett said, "and then you spent a year paying for it. We'd like you to come work here, if you're interested." "What's the project?" Daniel asked. "Affordable housing complex in the Runberg neighborhood. 120 units. Ground up. We need a lead structural engineer. When do you need a decision?" "Whenever you're ready." Daniel looked out the kitchen window at the live oak. Its canopy was full and green. It was May now, and Austin's spring was briefly perfect before the summer heat came in. "I'll come in Monday," he said. The Northbridge offices smelled like coffee and technical paper, a smell that reminded Daniel of the early years of his career, before everything had become digitized and optimized and stripped of the particular texture that physical artifacts give to professional work. Garrett introduced him to the team 7 engineers, 2 project managers, an architect named Rosalind Fry who had strong opinions about load path clarity and communicated them with admirable directness. He was given a desk in the open work area, a computer, a set of project files, and a key card. He opened the project files for the Runberg housing complex. He took out a new notebook, wire-bound, narrow rule, exactly the kind he had been using for 6 years, and wrote the date and the project name at the top of the first page. Lily was with him that week. He dropped her at school before coming in, and she had asked him, standing on the sidewalk in front of the building with her backpack shifted onto one shoulder and the morning light making her squint, "Is it a good job?" "I think so," he said. "Do you like building things?" He thought about it, actually thought about it, which was the kind of thing that 9 months of destruction teaches you to do with simple questions. "Yes," he said, "because buildings last. The ones you build, right? They last. And people live in them, or work in them, and they don't think about the steel, or the rebar, or any of it. They just live their lives in something that holds." Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "That's good," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He hugged her, watched her walk through the school's front doors, and drove to the warehouse in East Austin. At his desk, late in the morning, Rosalind leaned over and looked at his notebook, the careful columns, the batch references, the timestamps. "You really do write everything down," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "Good habit." "I know." He looked out the window at the construction site, visible from the far end of the warehouse, a different project. Already, mid-frame, the steel skeleton of something rising above the surrounding roof lines. A crane moved slowly across the upper portion of his view, precise and unhurried. He thought about what his father had told him 30 years ago, at a kitchen table 1,000 miles away from here. Asterisk. Your job is to make sure you can prove otherwise. Asterisk. He thought about a young engineer standing in a Cedar Park staging area, holding a report in his hands. He thought about a Friday afternoon in June, and a conference room, and a hallway camera, and 8 words in an email, and 11 months of everything that came after. And then he turned the page, picked up his pen, and started writing the next thing down. Victoria Kane pled guilty to perjury charges 14 months after the complaint was filed, under a negotiated agreement that included 2 years of probation, community service, and a permanent bar from holding officer or director positions in any Texas-registered corporation. She did not speak to the press. Marcus Reed contested his charges and accepted a plea to a reduced count of obstruction, receiving a fine and 18 months of supervised release. He resigned from Redwood's board the day before the plea was entered. Christine Okafor received whistleblower protections as part of the criminal proceedings. She later joined a nonprofit focused on HR compliance reform in the construction sector. The Suncrest Tower project was eventually transferred to a receiver, completed under new management with corrected materials, and opened 14 months behind its original schedule. The structural audit found no other significant deficiencies. Ryan Cole's long-form piece on the case ran at approximately 12,000 words. It won a Regional Journalism Award. He did not accept the award in person because he was in the middle of another investigation on the day of the ceremony. Daniel Brooks remained at Northbridge Engineering. The Rundberg housing complex opened on time, under budget, to a waiting list of more than 300 families. He still keeps the notebooks. There are 14 of them now, the one from the Suncrest Tower project, the gap where the months of suspension interrupted the sequence, and then a clean, consecutive line from the first day at Northbridge forward. He keeps them in the garage, on a shelf above the whiteboard. Lily, now 8, has taken to calling the shelf his evidence wall, which is not exactly inaccurate. "What are they for?" she asked him once, looking at the row of them. Daniel thought about it for a long time. "They're a record," he said finally, "of what actually happened." She pulled one off the shelf, not the Suncrest one, a later one, and opened it at random and looked at the dense, careful handwriting, the batch numbers and timestamps and names. She couldn't read most of it, but she looked at it seriously, the way she looked at most things. And then she put it back. "Good," she said. "Someone should keep track." He watched her walk back into the house. Outside, through the open garage door, the live oak moved slightly in a breeze that smelled like rain coming. Somewhere in the neighborhood, kids were playing. The street was ordinary and quiet and entirely sufficient. Daniel Brooks turned back to his desk, opened the current notebook to today's date, and started writing.